This is for part one of the experiment. My name is Joe Schmidt. The date and time is...
So this project is broken up into two main parts.
So to begin part 1, the coefficient of restitution is the reason that the ball doesn't bounce to the same height it was dropped at. It relates to the change in velocity before and after impact, which in turn affects the change in kinetic energy. Two examples of this are car accidents and boxing gloves. In car accidents, a high COR is desirable because that's a minor accident. In boxing gloves, a low COR is desirable because that means most of the kinetic energy is being dissipated.
Okay, so for the first experiment, we had 3 different plates and a bunch of different balls. From preliminary testing, we chose the acrylic and steel plate along with the Delrin and nylon balls.
And then we use slow motion and a ruler to measure each subsequent bounce. Using those heights and this equation, we could find the average COR. So for part 1, this was our goal, what we wanted to determine, the relevance to us mechies, and our expectations before the experiment. So here are our results with the 4 combinations, with the max being the nylon on aluminum and the minimum being the Delrin on acrylic. Something important to note here is that we actually thought the Delrin on aluminum would actually bounce the highest based on watching the videos the first time, so we mistakenly used that in part 2, but the E values are pretty similar, so it shouldn't really matter. Sweet, so at this point we had developed a good intuition about coefficient of restitution and found our bounciest combination. And this was done by just experimenting with different combinations of plates and balls and seeing how high they would bounce. And now we could compare our results to what you would find in literature. Except there's a problem. It's difficult to compare COR values because COR depends on lots of factors. With that said, the conclusion of our experiment is that either nylon or Delrin on an aluminum plate would be the best combination for part 2. But our project was by no means error-free, and here are just a few examples of some of the errors we encountered. And because of those errors, there was one discrepancy where the coefficient of restitution actually decreased with each bounce. In the end, I think the best way to get a better result would be just to place a camera with a macro lens a bit farther away to reduce that parallax.
Now that we're done with part 1, we're moving on to part 2. The time is now 1 p.m. still on April 8th, and I still videoed things.
And I recorded the data and measured the angle.
I changed the angle of the plate, set the obstacle, and pulled the pin for the ball to come up.
Nice.
To begin part 2, it's important to understand what projectile motion is, and that's basically the motion of an object being acted on primarily by the force of gravity where other forces are negligible. 2 examples of this are ballistics and sports analytics. And in both of these cases, projectile motion can be used to study and predict the path these objects will take.
The procedure for the second part of the experiment involved picking our best materials first, which was Delrin on the steel plate. And then what we wanted to do was choose any angle and then use this wood device along with the level to get the distance for the obstacle. And then we would drop the ball onto the steel plate, and then if it cleared the obstacle, we would measure the angle of this and then the max height based on the back of the ruler there. If not, we would just change the angle and repeat.
Moving on to the more theoretical side of things, we wanted to calculate whether or not our ball would clear the obstacle with a given E and theta value. And to start that, we needed to draw an FBD of our setup, which is shown here. Here we have all the velocities, angles, and constants needed in order to solve exactly that. Moving on to the actual calculations of this, we had to start with kinematics and an expression for coefficient of restitution to solve for V1 and V2. And then using conservation of linear momentum in the direction parallel to our plate, we could solve for V2 in another way and also find alpha using the V2 we found before. And then finally, we use 2 more kinematics expressions to find our time at the length of the obstacle and the height at that time. And in order to clear the obstacle, that HL needed to be greater than 3.75 inches. So to sum it all up, we found an expression for the height of the ball at the length of the obstacle given only theta and your value of coefficient of restitution. These equations were then implemented into a MATLAB code to find the range of angles that would clear the obstacle. It would also find the max height of the bounce from our chosen combination of materials. We then wanted to verify our MATLAB code by comparing the answer it would give to a recent homework we just did, and the answer it gave matched up perfectly with the actual answer of the homework. Knowing that our MATLAB code was verified, we found a range of angles from 9.6 to like 27.6 degrees, with a max height of around 12 inches at that 9.6 degree angle. But actually conducting the experiment revealed quite a big discrepancy. Even though our combination of a Delrin ball on an aluminum plate easily cleared the obstacle, it did so at a height of 11.23 inches and an angle of 17 degrees, which is way off from what our MATLAB code predicted. The reason for this discrepancy is really based off of the fact that the numerical calculations didn't account for the change in initial height with the angle, and it also doesn't take into account the drag and losses in energy. So in the end, our maximum experimental height was 11.23 inches with the Delrin ball bouncing on the aluminum plate. What's interesting here is that our experimental results don't match our theoretical results exactly, but the heights are pretty close. It's just the angle that's way off. In conclusion then, we found that Delrin and aluminum hit a max height of 11.23 inches and 17 degrees. Nylon may have been a bit bouncier, but the E values were very similar, and that could just be attributed to errors involved with each calculation. For part 2 though, the errors not only involve all of the errors we had in part 1, but also include an imprecise measuring device for both the angle and the obstacle placement. Even though most of the errors here couldn't really be avoided, we could have done a couple things to make our results a bit better. We could have used a better camera with a macro lens like I mentioned earlier, and we probably could have used a better angle measuring device because the iPhone angle just wasn't very precise. Alright, here's some sources. Thanks for watching.